As a pastor, one of the great privileges of my ministry is the opportunity to have conversations with many, many people, including many of you, in which people will share with me very honestly the highs and lows of their lives. And as I've been involved in those conversations over the last year or so, I've noticed a developing theme, and that is that there are many of us who are feeling discouraged, frustrated, anxious, and overwhelmed. And we're feeling that way for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of things that have happened in the last few years that have us feeling thrown for a loop. And if you're somebody that's been feeling that way, I don't judge you for that because I have those feelings myself. We all do. But as I've been listening to people express their frustrations and their anxieties and their sense of overwhelm, I've noticed something. And that is that many of us have a root cause of our discontent. And it's a misplacement of our priorities. And what I mean by that is this. We are really, really good at treating things of secondary importance as if they have primary value. And so we tend to get ourselves worked up, and we spend our time and energy, and we allow ourselves to be robbed of joy because of matters that are only of secondary importance. Now, I'm not trying to judge you for that, but we do that, don't we? Especially we who live in America, the country that is the wealthiest with the most convenience and luxuries in the history of the world. We are a people prone to struggle with first world problems. You know what I'm talking about, right? And first world problems are always problems of priority. They're problems we have to deal with, but they're not the most important thing. So here's something that I'm learning in my life. If I want to check in with my priorities and see whether I'm prioritizing life well, I ask myself this question. Whatever it is that's burdening me, will it matter in 5 years? If the answer is yes, it's probably an issue that you ought to prioritize. Right? If it's a matter of the health of your marriage or the health of your family, if it's a matter of your physical health, right, those things are going to mean something to you 5 years from now. You probably ought to prioritize those. But if it's something that you can honestly say isn't going to matter 5 years from now, then you might have to deal with it, but don't deal with it as your top priority. Don't give all your energy and thought to it. Don't let it be the thing that you lose sleep over at night. And yet, how many times do we lose sleep and do we stress over things that aren't going to make a world of difference 5 years from now? It was just the other day that I was having one of those days when I was feeling a little bit down and a little bit defeated. It felt like all I did was deal with problems all day, and none of them seemed to be bending my way. And so I was down. And Amy asked me, she said, well, why don't you just tell me what your problems are? And I came to a dead stop. I couldn't say a word, because when I thought about the problems that were having me so down, there wasn't one of them that made a whole lot of sense to voice, because none of them mattered 5 weeks from now, let alone 5 years from now. And it was in that moment that I was realizing something. My priorities were a little out of whack. And because my priorities were out of whack, I was giving weight to things that don't really matter. Now, some of those problems have to be dealt with, but they don't need to be my top priority. And they don't need to be things that I allow to consume my soul. So we got to figure out how to get our priorities right so that we're not constantly frustrated and discouraged and overwhelmed by secondary issues. There's the great leadership guru Michael Hyatt who once wrote that the people in life who experience the most joy and contentment are the people who have clarity about their priorities. They know how to answer the question, what's most important? And specifically, what's most important in God's eyes? Because you see, what's important in my eyes and what's important in your eyes isn't always the things that are important in God's eyes. But if we can know what's important in God's eyes, that'll help us with our priorities. And most of us, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know, like, there are some basic priorities and an order they go in. Like, most of us know that we should put God and our relationship with God first. And we know that after that, we have some important relationships with our spouse or our family or our best friends, right? Those relationships matter. Self-care matters. We should take care of ourselves in there. And then somewhere below all that, that's where our work's supposed to be. We know that. The thing that's really hard is actually making daily decisions and living in a daily existence where those priorities actually show up in the way that we live our lives. So it makes me wonder, are there any examples of people who have actually lived with their priorities straight? People who have actually put God first and let that cascade into everything else they do. And the good news is, yes, there are. And I'll lift up two of them. The first is Jesus. Jesus models healthy priorities. Check this out. Luke chapter 2, verse 42. These are the first recorded words of Jesus' life. He was a 12-year-old boy, and his parents took him to the temple in Jerusalem, and he stayed behind, and they lost him there. And when they came back and found him, they said, "Why'd you stay in the temple so long?" And this is what Jesus said. "Didn't you know I had to be about my Father's business?" How about that? 12-year-old boy who says, I got a priority, and my priority is the business of my Father. And I've been given work to do by my Father, and I'm going to make decisions in that way. And if you watch Jesus' life and ministry, he's constantly making decisions based on his sense of what God's will is. Right? The crowds would come to Jesus. They would want to be healed by Jesus. And Jesus would say, you know what? I need to leave. I need to go pray because I got to be in touch with the Father. And then he would come back and say, you know what? God's calling me. I got to go to the next town. Right? Every decision Jesus makes, every word he speaks is oriented around this one priority. I need to do my Father's business. And if you fast forward to John chapter 17, it's the last night before Jesus dies on the cross. He's praying to his Father in heaven, and he says this in 17 verse 4. I have brought you glory on earth by finishing the work you gave me to do. So Jesus shows us what it looks like to live a life of priority, right? From age 12, I'm here to do my Father's business. On the last day of his life, I've done the work you gave me to do. And everything in between was Jesus making decisions through the lens of my chief priority is to do the Father's will. So there's an example of a guy who had his priorities straight. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, that's Jesus. Of course he had his priorities straight. What about regular old people like me? Well, how about the example of the Apostle Paul? You remember Paul's early life? If ever there was a guy with his priorities out of whack, it was Paul. Paul thought that he was making God first in his life, but in reality, he was making himself first. He was a Pharisee who loved to look down his nose at other people, and he persecuted early Christians, and he sat and gave his blessing of approval over the stoning of Stephen. You remember that? Then he met Jesus, and his priorities got straightened up. And I want you to listen to what Paul says in Acts 20, verse 24. He says, I consider my life worth nothing to me. My only aim is to finish the race and complete the task the Lord Jesus has given me, the task of testifying to the good news of God's grace. Paul says, I got one mission in life. I got one aim. It's to run the race God has given me. And guess what? Paul ran that race throughout his life, and it meant that he gave up riches for poverty. He spent many nights with nowhere to sleep and with no food in his belly. He went to prison, and yet Paul would consistently say that he was content and he was full of joy. Why? Because his priorities were straight, and he was doing the work God gave him to do. Such that, fast forward to the end of Paul's life, and he writes to his understudy Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7, he says this, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. And friends, when I hear that, I say to myself, what do I got to do to reset my priorities so that today I can decide that my number one priority is to do God's work for my life, and at the end of my life, I'll be able to say, boy, I finished that race. I did it. How am I going to make God my top priority? Well, if there's anything Jesus and Paul in their lives teach us, it's that if you're going to make God your top priority, then you've got to adopt God's agenda for your life. And that could be a very different agenda from your own. I mean, we all have our own wants, desires, and dreams, but God isn't obligated to bless or energize your agenda. But God does promise to bless, energize, and give you what you need to do God's work in your life. Whatever that might look like, wherever that might lead you, you've got to adopt God's agenda. Pastor and author Rick Warren writes about this, and he says, you know, why is it that when God saves us, when we come into a saving relationship with Jesus, that he doesn't just take us up to heaven now? Why does he leave us in this earth to live this life of toil and hardship? And the answer is because God's got some business for you and I to do. Right? He's called us to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. We're supposed to live our lives in such a way that other people would look at us and they would see the good news of Jesus. And at the end of your life, it's not going to be the fortune that you've accumulated or the list of successes you have in your career. It's going to be the people that you reached with the love of Jesus. That's what's going to make the difference. And so your top priority is supposed to be God's agenda. What does God want for you in your life? So if you're going to reset your priorities, you've got to adopt God's agenda. And then I wonder, well, how could I even know what God's agenda is for me? And that's what leads us into Matthew 11. In Matthew 11, Jesus gives us an invitation. And if we heed it every day of our lives, this invitation will allow us to keep God as our top priority. And it will allow us to know how to handle every situation, every circumstance that comes our way. Now, the context of Matthew 11 is that Jesus has been rubbing up against the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the religious leaders of his day. And one of the things that Jesus felt was that the Pharisees had their priorities messed up. Now, the Pharisees would tell you that their priority was God, was to honor God. But their way of doing it was by imposing on people what was often referred to as the yoke of the Pharisees, or the yoke of the law. They read the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and they said there are 613 commandments there, and if you want God to be your top priority, you better meticulously follow all of them. Oh, and by the way, if you mess up, we'll be the first to tell you about it. Okay? This is what's going on. They're saying, you want to put God first? 613 commands, you better not mess them up. And it was a yoke that was put over people, and it was heavy. I want you to listen to what Jesus said about that yoke, the yoke of the Torah, in Matthew chapter 23, verse 4. Jesus said, they, that is the Pharisees, tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Jesus says about those Pharisees, they're putting a lot of weight on you to try to get you to obey 613 commands. They're not giving you much help along the way. It's cumbersome. And in Matthew 11, Jesus says, look, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the wise and the learned people, they haven't learned the key secret to how you're going to carry the burdens of life. They think you're going to carry the load by following the law. But let me tell you something. Little secret, Jesus says, Matthew 11:27. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Jesus says, all things have been committed to me. Did you ever sing that song when you were a kid? He's got the whole world in his hands. Jesus says, that's me. I got the whole world in my hands. All things are committed to me. So whatever you're anxious about, whatever you're frustrated about, whatever you're overwhelmed by, whatever you're burdened by, I got that in my hands. And I hold authority over all things. Oh, and by the way, I'm the Son of God. I'm the only one that knows the Father, and I can reveal the Father to anyone I choose. So if you want to know the God who made the universe, if you want to know the God that designed you, you're going to know him because I reveal him to you. Now tell me something. If you knew that there was a person who held authority over every problem that you will ever face, and that this person was the one who could reveal to you the very truth of God, would you not say, well, that ought to be my top priority? My top priority ought to be to hitch my wagon to that guy because he knows the truth. And he's the one that's going to lead me to life. You see, God's agenda for your life is to hitch your wagon to the one who holds all things. Now, Jesus says, look, all things have been committed to me. I hold all things. And then he makes this amazing invitation. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Now, I don't know about you, but rest sounds like something we could all use a little bit of. And Jesus says, when you're feeling burdened, when you're feeling weary, you come to me, I'll give you rest. And the rest Jesus is talking about, it's not a nap. It's not a vacation that comes and goes quickly. He's talking about that eternal rest when we find the peace that passes understanding. He's talking about that rest that comes when inside we know that there is nothing in this life that can separate us from the love of God. It's that peace that comes from knowing that no matter what we got to plow through in this world, there isn't anything that's as important as this one thing. There is a Jesus who holds all things, and when we come to him, he can give us peace. Jesus continues the invitation in verse 29. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Jesus invites us to take on his yoke. Now, I want to remind you how this yoke works. First of all, the yoke of Jesus isn't as ugly as this, but the way a yoke works is it ties two oxen together, right? And then it spreads the load so that they can maximize their strength to get through and carry the load. Right? When Jesus says to take his yoke upon him, he's got you sitting here. But who do you think's on the other side of the yoke? Well, this is Jesus' spot. When you take his yoke upon him, he says, you're going to learn from me. Jesus never promised you that you wouldn't have some things to plow through in your life. You're going to have some hard days. We all do. But he says, look, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. And you can look at me and I'll say, let me show you how I deal with this problem. And sometimes Jesus will say to you, you know how I deal with this problem? I just go away and pray because this problem isn't worth giving my time to. And sometimes he'll say to you, you know how I deal with this problem? I trust God's provision, and I take the next step. Do you know how I'm going to deal with this problem? I summon up my courage, and I put this thing in the perspective of eternity. Right? Jesus doesn't say you're never going to have a burden. He doesn't ever say you're not going to get weary, but he says, take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy, my burden is light. When you walk with Jesus, everything gets easier. Now, none of us ever want tragedy to strike in our lives. But I can tell you this, I've seen people who've gotten that cancer diagnosis, and because they walked with the yoke of Jesus, it doesn't make cancer easy, but it's easier to walk through when you're walking through it with Jesus. Because he's got this in perspective. I hold all things in my hands. I hold you in my hand. And even if this cancer doesn't go away, someday you're going to be in the kingdom of heaven where there's no more mourning or crying or sickness or pain. You see what I'm saying? When you put on the yoke of Jesus, it doesn't take every issue away, but it puts every issue in perspective. And perspective and priority matter. So what's the chief priority of your life? Chief priority is to come to Jesus. Take on his yoke and learn from him. I'm reminded of a saying from the great theologian and philosopher C.S. Lewis, who once wrote, I believe in Christianity as I believe in the rising sun, not simply because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else. You see, when you come to Jesus, it's not just that you see Jesus, but through Jesus, you have a lens through which to interpret everything else that's happening in your life. You got a problem in your marriage, you say to yourself, what is Jesus saying to me, and how's he going to teach me to get through this problem? And how's he going to bring us together as a couple as we go through this problem? You got a problem in your workplace, you say, what would Jesus have me do in this moment? How would Jesus have me pray? How is Jesus going to walk me through and plow through this thing? You got sickness in your family, you got worries about uncertainty around the future, you feeling a lot of anxiety in your heart and in your life, you might say to yourself, Jesus is my yoke mate. How am I going to see this problem through his lenses? And how am I going to remember that in the grand scheme of eternity, whatever problem you're going through is a drop in the ocean? The problems of today are here and then they're gone. So Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. I'll give you rest no matter what loads you're carrying. I'll give you rest no matter what burden is on you. I can make it lighter. I can make it easier, but you've got to come.